group of us started the Newark History Society about 10 years ago. Actually, we're going to have our 10th anniversary program in May. Ken Jackson from Columbia University is going to come over and be our speaker. That'll be at the Newark Public Library on May 2nd. We put on about 40 programs, but I think this is going to be one of the most interesting ones. And we're delighted to have Ulysses here. But first I want to note and thank Bob Marasco, the city clerk, for arranging for the videotaping of tonight's program. It will be shown at a later date on Channel 78 in town. I also want to encourage you, if you're interested in being on our mailing list and haven't filled out one of these forms, please do so. We're delighted to let you know about our future programs. Our next one will be on March 26th. It's going to be a little different. One of the things that we are sponsoring in town is the Newark Archives Project, an effort to identify original or documentary material about the history of Newark and have a website that helps guide people to those materials as a way of encouraging continuing research into Newark's long and very interesting history. We recently got our second grant from the New Jersey Historical Commission. And we have actually met our fundraising goal for the 2-year pilot project, which is good news. On the 26th of March here, Gail Malmgren, who is, where are you, Gail? There you are. Who's our project director, longtime archivist at the Tenement Library over at NYU, is taking the lead on this project. And Gail's going to be giving an update and telling us about some of the things that she's identified here at the Newark Museum, at the City Archives and such. I also want to thank Steve Tetamanti and the New Jersey Historical Society, which has been so good to us over the years in letting us meet here and have our programs. And Steve, do you want to bring a word of greeting?
Just a quick word. I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and it's really our pleasure to host the Newark History Society and all the great lectures that they do. I know tonight Julian and Newark is a subject that many people don't know a lot about, and I think I'm looking forward to a very interesting lecture. And I'll be hanging around tonight, so if anybody has any questions about the New Jersey Historical Society, our education programs, our museum, our research library, feel free to come up and just talk with me. So Tim, have a good lecture tonight, and thank you very, very much.
Well, in a crowd like this, Ulysses Deeds probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but let me do something really fast. Ulysses has been the curator of the Decorative Arts Collection at the Newark Museum for more than 30 years now. I like to think of him as one of Sam Miller's really brilliant hires. I can claim to probably having met Ulysses earlier than most of you, since I first met Ulysses when he was an undergraduate. I had returned to New Haven after doing some graduate work, and Ulysses was already one of the stars among the undergraduates in the late 1970s. And one of the best courses at Yale was the history of the American decorative arts. It kind of went by the popular name of pots and pans. There was a tremendous professor by the name of Charles Montgomery, who had a wonderful job of helping you look at the objects but place them in their historical context. And Charles Montgomery died, unfortunately, much younger than he should. But Ulysses was his kind of last and best student, and followed him to Winterthur, where Charles Montgomery had been on the faculty, and Ulysses got his master's at Winterthur in that wonderful program there. And it was from there that he came to Newark has been here for over 30 years and has put on blockbuster exhibit after blockbuster exhibit at the Newark Museum. He was just saying earlier he is on the board of the American Society of Jewelry Historians, if I've got that right, and actually often talks around the country about jewelry. He's an expert on pottery and furniture and other things as well, but he rarely gets the chance to talk about the history of the jewelry manufacturing, the jewelry industry in Newark, because most of the jewelry historians are actually more interested in the objects. He's going to be showing some objects, but when we met with Ulysses, we insisted that he also talk about the industry and its history in Newark. Ulysses?
Well, I'm floored by the size of this audience, and really, it's very cool to be here in Newark in the evening and talking to a room full of people instead of the last time I spoke to anybody. I was actually doing called Beyond Newark, which was about jewelry, and I was talking to the Gemological Institute of America's Alumni Association in Washington, D.C. And then the day before that, I was talking to Art Palm Beach on contemporary ceramics. All of it pimping our collection, which is really what my job is. And I apologize for this pompous screen. I've learned you need a title page, a pre-title page, and this is all museum branding. My full name is only used because the museum decided when I got all involved in the lawsuit against the Department of the Interior over Grant's tomb that they needed to take advantage of my name to make people pay attention to the Newark Museum. And that actually sort of worked for a while. And I'm the senior curator now because I'm the oldest living curator. And I'm the last one who remembers anything other than Mary Sue Price, who was there 5 years before I was. So, and the day I was hired, I was brought to the Essex Club for poached salmon with Sam Miller, who was the director, who was merciful enough to hire me fresh out of grad school at 24 with no experience and make me the head of the largest decorative arts collection in New Jersey with no experience at all. I mean, I had my little Beatrix Potter calendar on my desk, and I sat in my office. I thought, okay, what do I do now? And I guess it's taken me all this time to figure it out, now that I'm completely unemployable except by the Newark Museum. Miles, thank you for being willing to do this. I don't have a clicker, so we have a volunteer, a neighbor of the museum, because the audience, for all the fact that this is the American Society of Jewelry Historians, what they really all about, the big question is how many carats, what's the gem, what's the gem material, what's its source, is it South African, they really don't want to know the history of anything. And ultimately, they don't really care about Newark. All they know is that the stuff that was made in Newark has a very specific place in the market. The jewelry history world is very driven by the market. I teach at a conference every year which is called Jewelry Camp. And I'm the only museum person there out of an audience of 300 people. I'm the single museum person who goes to try to bang it into people's heads that basically I'm trying to convince them they should be giving things to museums, so that's not working either. So I really had to retool, because I shifted. The transition from slides to PowerPoint has been an ongoing nightmare. And once I learned PowerPoint, it's like a video game. And so I love putting together PowerPoint talks, but it basically is trying to remember all these things that I really don't think about. I had to reread my own book. And that's always a good thing. It's embarrassing when you can't remember what you've written. So I'm going to try to, I don't have that many slides because I'm not sure how far I'm going to wander, and I want to keep mindful of the time. I hope you will have questions, and I hope you'll be understanding. Well, I can't see my watch either, so I really think I can read that in the dark. And if I provoke questions, we've already had two people mention to me about Tiffany & Company. And Tiffany had a huge factory in Newark, which I visited while it was still operating, and collecting Tiffany silver from the Newark years, including the Super Bowl trophy, by the way, is something I've always been very interested in. But they didn't make jewelry here. Their jewelry was all made in Manhattan, in the store in Manhattan. And so, next slide, please. So I figured I better start with what I know least. Because we had, in the book was a wonderful essay. I'm blanked on his name, Kevin Smead, I think it was, who wrote on the labor, the jewelry, the labor history of the jewelry industry. And this is a story I told you at lunch that was very effective. And I just wanted to give you a sense of how powerful this was. Newark has been an industrial city for a long, long time. And the jewelry industry has been there right from the beginning of that growth as an industrial center. But this is an image of the Labor Day, the first Labor Day parade held on September 5th in 1882. And they actually held up the parade because the boat from Jersey City was late. And the Newark Jewelry Union workers were on that boat, and they had to lead the parade because they were considered the sort of aristocrats of the union world, of the laboring world. And they were the highest paid and considered the most refined and skilled of the manual workers, of the mechanics that filled America's cities, and Newark in specific. Next slide, please. And so this is an image which we have one of these. I know the Historical Society has one of these. The Public Library probably has one of these. This is an image of Mulberry Street, looking toward Down Neck, as before that even existed, and the Passaic River curling around in the 1820s, when Newark was basically a farm town. But early on, the industry, the manufacturing of jewelry as an industry, is born in the town of Newark, because it's not even a city yet. And I'm saying here by the 1820s, but it's, I'm supposed to be, I should have numbered these so I can actually, I have a note here that says silver spoons. I have no idea why I wrote that down. So this is what the town looks like, but already by this period in the 1820s, there are several manufacturers of speculative goods, and that's the key. The first time the history of the Newark industry is ever talked about, and I'll refer to this again, is at the great the Newark-only Industrial Exposition of 1872, which I will expand on. And there they talk about the fact that there was one man named Epaphras Hinsdale who in 1801, which is I think a completely made up, sometime in the early aughts of the 1800s, while Jane Austen was still alive. I just read Death Comes to Pemberley, so I've got it on my mind. That Epaphras Hinsdale decided he was going to set up an elegant little factory on Broad Street in Newark with 6 full-time bench workers who could be seen from the windows of the street, and who made jewelry not for a specific customer, but made jewelry that somebody might want. And that whole idea of making goods on spec is, of course, the engine that drives the entire 19th century. And eventually, Mr. Hinsdale goes into partnership with a man named Taylor, Taylor and Hinsdale, and they set up a shop in New York City to sell fancy goods, wholesale, jewelry and silver, because somewhere in New Jersey is a toast rack with the mark of Taylor and Hinsdale on it, the only one known. And I don't know where it is. But it was also, so it established that idea of the notion of a shop where stuff is made, and then an office in New York City, which is 3 rivers away but only 10 miles, where you begin to market those goods to an audience that goes even further than that. And New York, by that point, was already becoming the major sort of processor of goods and marketer of goods before the big Midwestern cities began to rise up. And so Hinsdale dies in 1810, and his son goes into business with John Taylor. And sorry, I jumped myself all over that. And then, okay, next slide, please. I got most of the points in there. I really need to go up to a 24-point type on these things. So I just see I threw a few objects in here because these are sort of the problem with early Newark jewelry, and the problem with jewelry in this country always is that marking things is very dodgy. This is true of any goods made in the United States or in colonial America, that marks were kind of iffy because nobody quite bought the idea that locally made goods were as good as imported goods, and there's a lot of mythology that rises up around that, which I don't actually tend to believe anymore. But the fact is, early in the day, Newark, as a manufacturing center for jewelry, developed a reputation for fair dealing and superior workmanship. So by the 1840s and 50s and 60s, there were a substantial number of, there are statistics in here which I'll try to remember if I can see them. But these are all things that I'm either sure or pretty sure were made in Newark because of their provenances and because of because of family legend. The piece on the left, the gold watch case, was made in the 1860s by Baldwin and Company. The Baldwins were one of the founding families of Newark, and by the 1840s they had what was called the Newark Jewelry Store, which also manufactured silver. We have silver in our collection from them. And they made jewelry, and this is one of the few pieces known to have been made by them, which is a gold watch case made by Baldwin and Company. In fact, it's the only Baldwin watch I've ever seen. Came to us directly from a member of the family who gave it to us in the 1920s. And up above that is another piece from the Baldwin family, directly from the Baldwin family, that was, according to the family legend, was made for Tiffany and Company in the sort of Egyptian revival style of the 1860s. That's actually a porcelain plaque with a painting of the pharaoh's head. Not the most exotic piece of jewelry, but in fact, it would have been a kind of a cutting-edge fashion object aimed at a middle-class market, but interestingly, made to be retailed by Tiffany and Company. Because already by the Civil War, and during the Civil War, luxury good production in the North in the United States tripled. Silver and jewelry production tripled during the Civil War because there was all this money being made in the North for the first time, and all the money in the South was disappearing, which had been the major market for these goods before. And on the right, these anonymous gold chains with little filigree ball clasps made for children belonged to the family of Marcus Ward and came to the museum in 1921 with his estate. And these are clearly, we actually have portraits of the children wearing these, and these were obviously made in Newark by somebody, we just don't know who. Next slide, please. I have no idea which slide I'm on anymore. Okay, here we go, I can tell that. So the key thing to take away from that last part is that Newark jewelry, until a certain moment, and I'll get there, is never marked. It's not marked with a carat weight, it's not marked 14 karat, 18 karat, it's totally blank. So a lot of it was assumed to be costume jewelry because it was unmarked. That's just, it's not true. And the fact is that it was based on reputation, anonymity and reputation, so that retailers, jewelry stores all across the country began to market these things. When does the industry exists, but it really begins to boom as a result after the Civil War with an enormous uptick in American incomes. Here you have just, I couldn't resist this. This is an old photograph of the Kremens factory, because by the 1870s, Kremens and Company was actually not the biggest, but the second biggest jewelry manufacturer, or maybe even the third biggest jewelry manufacturer in the United States, and also in Newark at the same time, because by then Newark was in fact the largest producer of gold goods in the Western Hemisphere. Oh, and that's what the point of this was. There you see a few little collar buttons that were kicking around in our collection in 14 karat gold by Kremens and Company. Now, the only people left in the world who use collar buttons are priests and Arabs. And in fact, there is still a market for them, but Kremens at one point made 1.5 million collar buttons a year, and they were just one of the manufacturers. And Kremens made his money. This became the hallmark for the Kremens jewelry in the 1890s, is he developed it. George Kremens developed the whole idea of single-piece stamped gold collar buttons by watching the way bullet casings were made during the Civil War, and that the same machinery that was used to stamp out a bullet casing or a shell was the same process you used with a few more steps to make a one-piece collar button, because you know how annoying it is when you're trying to get your collar on and the collar button snaps because it's soldered together and not made in one piece. So this very unglamorous little object really sort of symbolizes the whole backbone, the mass-produced bread and butter goods that every jewelry store in America sold Kremens collar buttons. Thousands and thousands of stores, including Tiffany. Tiffany doesn't make their own collar buttons, they buy them from Kremens. Kremens has a relationship with Tiffany and Company right up until the time they sell the business, which is the same day we opened our exhibition in 1997. Thank you, Richard Kremens. Next slide, please. But other documents that have cropped up. When I started at the Newark Museum, I had no idea there was a jewelry industry. And one of our trustees, named Shanley, which is a name that resonates through Newark, gave us a gold spectacle case that his great-grandfather had been given for their wedding anniversary. And he said, oh, by the way, it was made in Newark. He ran a jewelry company. And I thought, what? And that started this all. Like 1992, that happened. And they weren't even a very big jewelry company, because the Shanleys had a lot of other stuff going on, and jewelry was like a passing fancy for them, but they had a factory. But documents like that were helpful in trying to figure out the scale of what was going on. This is a piece quoting from the Newark Evening News of 1868, made in Newark by Newark Mechanics, was a testimonial medallion, an award given to Thomas Petty, the leather manufacturer who built Petty Memorial Church, founded the Petty School, and he was a huge promoter of industry in Newark and a great supporter of the jewelry industry. So a specific branch of that industry, one of the, and I'll explain why I think they happen to be the biggest name at the moment. They were not the biggest company, of James Durand and Company, James Madison Durand, who was the nephew of Asher Durand and the nephew of Cyrus Durand, who was a silversmith in Newark in the early 1800s. But they made this for this specific event. And in fact, this had no inscription on it at all. This came to us from the family in the 1930s. I thought, ooh, I'll bet this thing was made in Newark, but I've got to prove it, because it shows every aspect of jewelry making. It shows sort of the initials, the die stamping, the beading, the mechanical processing of ornament, the chain making, plus there's all this wonderful symbolism about the city and the beehive and all of those. It's all about industry. So I said it's got a date on it, a very specific date in 1868, and I had my volunteer go and look. And by golly, front page story in the Newark Evening News all about this medallion being given to Thomas Petty, saying made by Durand and Company, and it cost $250 because the price was always important, and that's a lot of money in gold. It's actually the most important piece of gold of this vintage known in any museum in the country in terms of jewelry made for a man. Next slide, please, Miles. So here we said, I know this is a little confusing because it says this is a shot out of the Newark City directories. We have a full run of them in the museum, and they are an endless source of information. It's one of the most valuable and bottomless mines of information. But this is Military Park as it looked in 1872, and in fact the only recognizable thing left in it is the spire of Trinity Cathedral, which was in fact, the rector there was the father of Monsignor Doane, which is another whole complicated story, who was one of our founding trustees. It's one of the reasons we actually collect art as opposed to simply tchotchkes. Mr. Dana didn't believe in art, but that's a whole other lecture. But by the time this image is taken, then this is an important year in 1872, and you'll see why I get to that. Newark already, by 1836, the year it is made a city. It is named a city, as opposed to whatever it was called before, the town of Newark. There were 6 factories in full operation making gold, with 100 people, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot in the 1830s. And they had a total annual product of $180,000, which is sort of $3.5 million in modern day money. So it's a substantial jewelry industry and already the largest production center in the country. Next slide, please. And that is partly being fueled by the influx of Germans who, and someone asked me, this is an image of the German neighborhood in Newark, which is really up off of High Street. It's a slightly sleazy looking image because I think, well, there is then as now, there is always, people who are writing public histories always have issues with immigrant populations. And so, but if you look, and you'll see another image shortly, there was a huge conglomeration of Germans, both Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, because German was the more important of the identities, that had been building since the 1840s, when there were German populations fleeing all of the German-speaking countries in Europe because of revolution going on there. And they were sometimes bypassing Castle Garden in New York City and coming right into Newark. Because once you get a certain core population, people come there because they have relatives, they have friends. And Newark already was known as a place for jewelry makers, and some of the leading places for exporting labor was Pforzheim, which was the center, still is the center of jewelry production for middle-class jewelry in Europe. Next, please. So this belongs to the, who owns this? Public Library, I think, owns this. We've gotten so many complaints about this over the years because they think I made it up, and I said, no. As much fun as that would have been, I really just trusted history. But here you see, this is the German neighborhood, and what they were really talking about in that image is here, where you get quite hilly. And just to give you a sense of that, this is Broad Street right there, and Washington Park is somewhere like there, I think, or maybe that's Military Park, I'm not sure which, but all the little triangles are up that way. But you can see that it was an enormous German population, and the jewelry manufacturers would have been part of that community. And another horrible task I assigned my volunteer to, and she took weeks and weeks going through the directories, literally counting every single German name involved with precious metals in Newark for 30 years. And I put it all in like this one sentence in the book, because basically what I was trying to prove is that in 1850, everybody involved in the jewelry trade, most of them were Anglo, and by 1890 they were all Germans. So that was my big point. But it was hugely, I mean, it's a simple route to proving that it was a very German industry. Although the main names on many of the companies were in fact still Anglo. And ironically, the Krementzes, who were the biggest German manufacturers, had in fact been farmers in Indiana and migrated east to become industrialists. They didn't migrate from Germany at all. So that completely messes the history up, and I ignored most of it. Next, please. Where are we here? So back to 1872. The key event in 1872 is the expansion of what was known as the rink. And the rink was a roller skating rink in downtown Newark, which was used for exhibitions and sanitary fairs and stuff. And that whole wonderful Second Empire building was built in 1872 as an exposition hall. And you can see, I can't make it any bigger because it's so blurry. I must have like photoshopped this out of a magazine or something. But there's the interior of the space. And it was the first of a whole long series of Newark-only industrial expositions that talked about all the huge things, and it ranged from ladies who did painted fans and ornaments out of shells. There was one African-American producer of gold eardrops, which meant earrings, so there was an African-American jewelry maker in Newark, but nobody bothered to say what his name was, in one of those interesting oversights. And but interestingly in that, the dominant name in the jewelry industry there, and they talked about it, there was a lot of publicity about it, was an exposition of diamond jewelry by Durand and Company. And I have a terrible feeling there were about 9 manufacturers out of the dozen or so that were already in Newark that showed any interest in this exposition in 1872. And probably because Durand and Company pulled out all of its guns and got this flashy display of diamond jewelry worth $120,000 in 1872 out of the total value of $900,000 of the goods that were on display. So the jewelry display was very flashy. And I'm trying to figure out, why did Durand, when Krementz was already going strong, Ferdinand Herpers was already going strong, neither of them show in this, why aren't they in this? And then I realized that, so Durand and Company has all this diamond jewelry because Charles Louis Tiffany, who owns Tiffany and Company, is on the board of directors of Durand and Company, and stays on the board of directors until 1883, which is the same year that Tiffany and Company invents the Tiffany setting, which is based on a patent that had simply expired from a Newark manufacturer, although don't tell them I told you that. So Tiffany and Company, in fact, was very deeply entrenched in the Newark jewelry industry from its beginnings, and it's pretty sure that before Tiffany started really manufacturing its own goods in the 1880s, that most of their jewelry was actually made in Newark, and the settings for their diamonds and all of that stuff. Not the gemstones, but the settings were produced here. Next slide, please. Oh, here, good, perfect. And indeed, this is one of those big factories that by 1872, this is taken from the directory in 1879 because it was a better page, but this factory exists earlier in the pages of the Newark City directories. But Carter, Howkins, and Sloan. Aaron Carter is a jeweler in the 1840s and 50s in Newark. By the 1870s, they have a factory with 500 employees working 7 days a week in shifts producing gold jewelry around the clock, because they don't shut down the factories, they simply rotate the shifts of the workers. And on the right is a woven silver wire sort of armlet out of a Cobra by Carter Guff and Company. The company changed names 16 times. And so Carter is the name that stays. Carter, Howkins, and Sloan splits off, then you get Carter Guff, and they end up getting bought out by Krementz during the Depression. And on the left are a series of men's watch fobs and a woman's watch fob, all made by Carter and whoever in Newark somewhere in the early 20th century. And these were the kinds of things that are being sold in jewelry stores everywhere. But the important thing is you can't think of this as a local business. Certainly the retailers in Newark are selling Newark jewelry. But I've seen catalogs from Wiss & Company from the 1930s, the big jewelry store in Newark, and they don't talk about Newark jewelry at all. and you don't know where their stuff's being made. They're like everybody else. They buy it they buy whatever is going to sell. And that was the trick of the industry. Next, please. And you'll hear more about factories. Because factories came both large and small. And this is one of my favorite images because in the 1920s and then on through the 70s, we continually were given material which we didn't pay enough attention to, but we've worked a lot on it since then, by the Herpers family. Ferdinand Herpers emigrated from Germany in the 1840s and knocked around Newark, working for all of the other companies, working for the Carters, working for Krementz, and finally in 1865, just at the end of the Civil War, set up his own shop. And there is his shop. I believe at least 10 years ago, the building still stood on Crawford Street in Newark, downtown, and the family's house was here on Washington Street. And it was a small shop with about 30 employees, but they in fact were the first mass producers of findings. So that if you were a jewelry maker in Nome, Alaska, and we have examples in the collection, I know they're from Nome, made with fossil ivory and gold nuggets from the Yukon strike, that you could buy the safety catch, you could buy the pin, you could buy the frame, you could buy the little gewgaws, you could buy the prong settings, and I'll get to that. This is a piece set with rhinestones that belong to Mrs. Herpers, and as I always joke, because you're worth it to a point. I mean, he was a middle-class jewelry maker. He couldn't afford all those diamonds. But these things were being designed in the this is about 1872, that they're being designed to hold the new diamonds that are coming out of the Kimberley Pipes in South Africa. The first mass production of diamonds in the history of the human race. And suddenly diamonds were available to people who were considered middle class. And of course, not everybody could afford all of those. But that's why ours are rhinestones. And that's the only reason that piece survives, is that rhinestone, if these had been real diamonds, they would have been broken up and gotten rid of long ago. But this is much more typical of what Herpers made, because they developed the technology to mass produce little half balls, to produce things, yards and yards. I'll show you more of this. The little tubes, the half tubes, the beading, all of the little rickrack that you could assemble like pieces in a puzzle and produce your own original goods. Although I've never seen anything in silver from that period, so I guess silver didn't sell well. Silver was too cheap to be worthwhile as jewelry, interestingly enough. Next, please. And this is the kind of archival material we have in the museum collection that just blows my mind from the Herpers family. I see I'm not really that bad on the typography. It all got screwed up through the different machines. And this is a terrible image, but this is the color of it. This is from the 1860s when they're still on Washington Street, when they're still in the small shop. And you can see these are galleries that you can use for all sorts of different things. And they were sold by the inch. You could get them in 14, 18 carat, and later on in platinum. Very little 10 carat made in Newark. We were more upscale than that. But this is, I think, possibly the only one of these known to have survived from any jewelry maker from that early. This is before the Civil War, in fact. And then next to it is the patent that appeared just about the time the exposition was held in 1872 at the Rink for the first prong setting to hold these new South African diamonds. And the whole idea being, here's an old prong setting based on their galleries, because you could just wrap these around and create a setting for stones. But it's an asterisk. This apparently didn't work very well somehow, because I've only seen a few pieces of jewelry with this in it. But it's the earliest patent diamond setting known in the United States. And it either didn't work or it was too difficult to make or something. But it's a fairly cool thing, and it's happening at just the moment. And it's all this exposition, but it's all about this sort of solving problems by identifying new technologies to produce stuff faster, cheaper, and in larger quantity. Because as the population grows and middle-class women demand gold, real gold, the Newark industry just booms and booms. Next. And Ferdinand Herpers is not the only one. This is one of the most staunchly Anglo firms, W.C. Edge & Company. And sadly, that bracelet on the left was in the exhibition in 1997, my exhibition, not the 19th century one. And I love this piece because these are probably all Herpers bits and pieces, but the chains are what Edge specialized in. And I couldn't get that. The family owns 2 of those, and they wouldn't give me one. And I wasn't about to resort to violence yet. I was still naive then. But W.C. Edge, William C. Edge, was the king of chains. That sounds a little kinky. But you can see their shop in New York City, but their factory is in Newark, New Jersey, and patented goods. This was all about patenting processes and designs, but more about process. And Edge is a fascinating example of that because he basically, when he comes in, he emigrates from England and sets up this shop in Newark. It costs about $1 a foot, just the labor, to produce gold foxtail chain, which is a standard element of every piece of jewelry, especially the chains that women wear pendants on. And through all of his various patents, by the late 1870s, he had dropped the cost per foot down to 40 cents from $1. And then in 1889, he took a final patent that dropped the cost to 2 cents a foot from the original $1. So you can see why all of the chains produced in most of the jewelry that was worn and made by most people in America was produced in this factory. But he wasn't the only one making chains. We'll get on. This is from a marvelous book that we borrowed from somebody. Unfortunately, I photographed all the pages out of it, so we have all of those. These were advertising books. These are all for the trade, not for public consumption. So in the background, next slide, please. And something that you all need to know about, because one of the great names that maybe you don't know this, I mean, you old timers know that Engelhard Industries was a big thing in Newark, and Charlie Engelhard was the trustee and the model for Goldfinger, because they not only owned factories in Newark, but they owned gold mines in South Africa, and were friends of Ian Fleming. But in fact, the sweeping and assay companies were the backbone of the Newark jewelry industry. This was the processing behind. The city also manufactured all of the machinery for making jewelry, but also the assayers and sweep melters. And this is Lelong and Company's not the only one. There are several of them over on Mulberry Street and toward the Ironbound. And what they do is they assay gold, they create the alloys for companies that weren't big enough to do it. Krementz always made its own alloys, but they couldn't do their own assay, their sweep melting. And what they meant is that at the end of the day, in every factory, you swept the dust off the floor and put it into a bag, and you sent that to a sweep assayer, and they would burn it and then take all the lost gold dust from the files and the saws and whatever the machinery was. And in fact, Richard Krementz told me that when in the old factory on Chestnut Street, Walnut Street, Chestnut, thank you, that when they wanted to replace the windows of that factory in the 1950s, they tore out all the windows, sent them to a sweep assayer, and the gold dust stuck in those window frames paid for the new windows. $100,000 in gold dust. It was an important part of the industry. But the other side of that was the alloying, platinum. Every piece of platinum jewelry made by Tiffany and Cartier and every big jeweler in America in the 1890s and 1900s, all of that platinum came through Newark. Not 1 ounce of it came from anywhere else. They controlled the platinum industry. And that's where Engelhard came in the 40s and bought all the remnants of this. Next, please. And just another, because what drove the Newark industry, it was variety, because Americans, unlike any other people on earth, demand constant novelty. We are herders, we follow the crowd, but we at the same time want to be unique and individual and just like everybody else. And it requires production of large quantities so that you can vary things in little ways, which only batch production or mass production can do. Here's an ad for Andrew J. Hedges and Company. Again, one of those Anglo names that was mostly German workers. And 3 pieces in our collection at the museum, all produced by them in the 1880s and 90s. And Newark stuff is small. The biggest piece tends to be about 1.25 inches across. They didn't do big, flashy stuff, with a few exceptions, and I'll get there. These little veil pins were a novelty in 1886, 87. And here you see one that's tiny. It's 1 inch across, demantoid garnets and diamonds. I call these Newark diamonds. They cost about $5 each. They're tiny, and they were really used not to see them as diamonds, but to provide sparkle. So you could talk about diamonds, but it was hard to see them unless you were really close. And then that sort of the bracelet of kind of patchwork gold. It was a patent process that Hedges came up with. And then Hedges was awesome with the enameling. They did beautiful enameling. Newark was the center of the finest jewelry enameling anywhere. And there was fancier enameling done enameling done in big cities like Tiffany and Company in New York, but it was no better. It was just more elaborate enameling because it was bigger, more expensive pieces. But again, you see the factory on Mechanic Street and then the office on Maiden Lane or Pearl Street or various places in New York City. And I say black and white enameled goods especially. What does that mean? For mourning jewelry, black enameled gold. Why do you wear gold jewelry if it's covered in black enamel? I don't know. We have a whole set of it made in Newark. And then white goods, men who wore a white tie would wear white linen collar buttons that were actually gold enameled white. Because you could. That's all I can say. Next, please. And here's a typical example of the front office. This is Enos Richardson and Company, a very important name that we'll get to, right above the Gorham outlet, before Gorham opened their own retail store in New York City to compete with Tiffany and Company. And then you actually have other ones. Larder Elcox, Larder and Sons was a hugely important jewelry maker for cufflinks and things like that. And some of these are not Newark at all, but you can see these. And that part of New York City was just packed with these office buildings full of wholesale jobbers for the trade. Next, please. And of course, is this is 1929. 1929. We did an exhibition, believe it or not, on the Newark jewelry industry in 1929 in the summer, optimistically. Mr. Dana had just died. And we talked about the fact that in 1929, Newark produced 90% of the gold in America came out of Newark. And that included 50% of the 18-karat gold. And it was known as the city of diamonds and sapphires and diamonds and platinum and precious stones. No, gold and platinum and precious stones. And that would all begin to collapse as the economy collapsed in the fall of 1929. But all of these are the various jewelry manufacturers. And the point of all of this is you're seeing the marks that began to appear. In 1896, I don't even think it was a law, there was a rule passed, a suggestion, a guideline, that if you wanted to, you could mark your jewelry with some sort of an insignium that said, "This is my company." So that the trade people who were buying at the wholesale marts in Chicago or wherever they were buying them, the big jewelry mart in Chicago, would know who it was, saying, "Oh, that's a piece of Kremens, I know they're good, so we'll do that." It was not for public consumption at all. None of these names, not one of them, including Kremens, was known as a brand name beyond the trade itself. And it wasn't until the 1960s that you legally were required to put the gold mark, the 14 karat, 18 karat. It's that recent, 1964. But voluntarily, the Newark industry began to mark things early because they knew it helped their trade. Next, please. And here you have, this is a 1911 broadside aimed at the jobbers, because most of this, and in fact the beginning of the sort of downfall of the Newark industry in some ways, is there are so many manufacturers. There are 4,000 people in a couple of hundred shops, big and small, working in Newark. In fact, Kremens and Company rented out space to small jewelry manufacturers with just a few people in their own factory, competitors in a sense. And what begins to undermine the Newark trade is they begin to try to do retail. They begin to try to advertise. Kremens and Company advertises in Vogue in the 1920s, which undermines their retail market because Tiffany doesn't want to buy from them if they're selling under their own name. It's a whole complicated thing. But here's the Unger Brothers factory. We think of them as silver manufacturers, but they produce thousands of pieces of silver jewelry, which sold from $1 to $5 a piece. And they did have a retail shop. And this is in the New Jersey Historical Society collection, totally ripping off Alphonse Mucha. But this is their Christmas catalog from 1902. Basically saying it's pretty and it's cheap, come to our shop and buy it. They also made cut glass. So it's this sort of this local retail that begins to build into a desire to sell retail nationally that begins to undermine the stability because of all the competition from all the different factories by getting into the 1920s. Next, please. And I had to throw this in simply because it's an important thing to understand is that the industry, it's a very stable industry. The unions are very strong and very taken care of and very much honored when in fact certain unions aren't honored in different places. But this, I'm bringing this because these Newark Industrial Expositions lasted well into the 19-teens where they were more about labor than they were about product. But then this is just the union card of a jeweler named Herman Grote, a German immigrant who came to Newark and worked for Enos Richardson and Company. And it was Herman Grote is the one who locked the door in 1969 on the Enos Richardson factory that had been the largest factory in the Western Hemisphere for a while, and simply locked the door and walked away with a box of stuff, which his daughter-in-law, 40 years later, gave us. And that's his union card from there. Next, please. If you really want to read about the labor in the Newark industry, read Kevin Smead's chapter in the book. Now I'm going to start coughing all of a sudden. My favorite artifact that cropped up in the course of all this is this little book, and this is, I tinted this, you know, this is like bad Photoshop, but it's sort of ochre colored, but it's a little 5x7 booklet called The Manufacture of Gold Jewelry, Compliments of Enos Richardson and Company. And what it really is, it's the only known step-by-step analysis of how jewelry was made in 1882, published by the largest producer of jewelry in Newark at the time, with 700 employees over 4 floors. And this is the factory as it looked. It's all woodcuts. This was discovered by a woman who was writing a big book on jewelry in America. And as soon as she published that book, she gave us this. And it's one of the most important documents of its kind. Plus, we have that other Enos Richardson archives from the 1930s and 40s. So next slide, please. And it goes floor by floor. It has floor plans, basement, first, second, third floor. It's the only known document like this that really lays out the structure and the layout of an early industrial factory that's powered by coal and belts and machinery. So, and I obviously, I could actually do a whole lecture on nothing but going through the factory, but I thought I wouldn't I just had fun making red arrows. But down in the basement, all the dirty stuff is in the basement, the materials needed for it. And of course, the coat room. The filters, that just means where you wash all the clothes so that all the gold dust out of your pockets goes into the assayers. But there you see the engine room, because these were steam-powered. The first steam-powered jewelry making was developed by the Carters after the Crystal Palace Exposition in the 1850s. But Enos Richardson was really going. So this is a central energy source that runs all of the belts, that run all of the machines that make the jewelry. Next slide, please. And we'll go sort of, and this is not as detailed, don't groan, it's not going to be that bad, but tools, tool making of dies, the making of tools is largely, you could buy them from outside sources. There were die sinkers, there were tool makers, but in a big factory you made your own. A set of dies like this, these are just for charms from the 1920s, a horse and a little dog. But these things were worth thousands of dollars because they're hand-carved steel, and that without those you cannot manufacture. And those, in fact, were considered more valuable than the jewelry itself. And so you still find caches of those around. We couldn't get this guy to give us the stuff either. He still owns a lot of the archives of a different company. And then here you see the main room, just simply called the main room, because this is where all the bench workers worked along the walls. No machinery for that, it's all the handwork. But then the machines for drop stamping, because Newark jewelry is drop stamped, you don't cast. Good jewelry is actually never cast. And the whole idea of cast jewelry being more artistic is something that's been promoted post-World War II, because cast jewelry has bubbles in the gold, it's fragile, it's brittle. Drop stamp jewelry is very tough. And middle-class stuff had to be tough, because middle-class people want their stuff to last. They can't just break it and send it out to be fixed. And then here, I couldn't resist this, the coloring room, which sounds like you're thinking, what the hell does that mean? Coloring is this is a Sloan & Company chatelaine hook with its original coloring on it. And all this sort of matted, it looks very orange in this picture. But in fact, you took a piece of gold, and after it was manufactured and put together, before you enameled it and set the jewels, you dipped it in a bath of acid, which ate all of the alloy off the surface, and you ended up with a matte 24-karat finish, which was called colored. And that was a look, a Roman surface it was called, that was very popular in the period and something that Newark specialized in. Next, please. And then you have the polishing room and the engraving room, which also include the firing for the enamels. This little piece, about 1.25 inches long, by Riker Brothers, is all that tiny little piece is all hand engraved, and then it's enameled, and then it's polished by women because they're delicate and they don't break things, and we can pay them less. Yeah, and then it's all set by the gem setters with little demantoid garnets and a diamond and rubies. This thing, 1.25 inches long. It's the only one of these I've ever seen. by this manufacturer, and you can tell Riker Brothers from their enameling instantly. But this is the way things worked, and it was divided by task and by gender. And then up on the top floor, I guess because it was easier for them, next please, where it was easier to get upstairs, are the rather sinisterly named girls' chain room and boys' chain room. And at least they kept the boys and the girls separate. And these are people who were apprentices and underage who are learning the field, but also because they have little hands. And before the mass production development by W.C. Edge in 1889, the chains are all braided by hand. All of those intricate chains from the 19th century are hand woven. And there's all these strict sort of moral laws about not only do you have to keep children separate, but you can pay them even less than you pay women, and they can climb to the top story of the place. And the main, I don't know what happened in the main chain room. I guess there was random integration of male and female, probably adults actually. And these are the young people. And by young people, I mean ages from 8 to 13 until they reached apprentice, until they graduated out of that. And I just threw this in here because what galvanizing means is plating. And in factories like this is William B. Kerr and Company, this is a gold-plated silver brooch. And that's what galvanizing would have been. It's different from the coloring room where you're dealing with gold. But galvanizing, if you want a colored finish on something that doesn't match the surface underneath it. And you can see for all the mechanical work, you're talking about a factory with machines. You're talking about a man and a gadget. You're not talking about, this isn't Ford Motors with assembly lines. This is still very much small scale. Basically, most of these are hand operations with machine assistance. So the idea that it's machine made was a good thing in the 19th century. Or modern, we used machines. It was not a sign, it was not a denigrating kind of a thing. So they were very proud of their machinery. Next. And so I'm getting down to the last few. Here are some of the trademarks with some examples from it, because the whole core of the Newark industry was beautiful, elegant, quality goods for everybody. It wasn't the cheap jewelry, which is what it was called, from Providence. It wasn't costume, it wasn't gold-plated. Only Krementz makes plated goods, and they do that to keep from going under during the Depression. And they basically saved the industry by producing costume jewelry, and never once ever referring to it as costume jewelry. Krementz did the trick of selling costume jewelry as fine jewelry, and it was a marketing ploy that was worthy of Mad Men. I'm just sorry it didn't crop up on Mad Men. Of course, it's 1940s. But you have Alling and Company, one of the oldest firms, and there you have a sort of a mass market gold bracelet with an enameled sort of Byzantine lady. But all of these elements, they could have bought some of those from Herpers. They could have made them themselves. It's all made out of bits and pieces. You find those same medallions used as lockets, used as tie pins, used as brooches. And then down below, Bippert and Company, which is always marked with a little torch. These are marks you see on jewelry. And there we have a piece with matrix turquoise and a Baroque pearl. Baroque pearls are great. They're all freshwater American river pearls, and they look great. They're very artistic, but they're cheap, because they're river pearls and they're not perfect. So they're very big in Newark jewelry. Lots of little Baroque freshwater pearls. Next, please. And then there's Krementz. It looks like people say it looks like the snout of a dog, and it sort of does. But that's the cross-section of the famous collar button that made them so much money. And a really jazzy piece of Krementz platinum and diamond and sapphire jewelry. Very definitely made for a high-end retailer. Whoever bought that piece did not know it was made by Krementz. If you know you're buying a piece of Krementz, you're buying a piece of costume jewelry from the rolled gold era from the 1930s on. Because this sort of thing is what was being made for Tiffany and Cartier and Peacock and Shreve and all of the big jewelers across the country. And down below, possibly the highest end jewelry manufacturer, the archives of which survive in this institution, the New Jersey Historical Society, the Crescent and Arrow of Henry Blank and Company. And here our icon piece, and she literally is this big. One of the most popular things, patented in 1904. These averaged, ours probably cost $100 retail in 1904. The taming of the wild Art Nouveau of René Lalique, but basically the kind of high-end artistic jewelry that was aimed at the best jewelry for a middle-class woman or everyday jewelry for a rich man's wife. And these things certainly would have been sold by Cartier. We know that Henry Blank and Company survives the Depression because Cartier and Tiffany are their retailers, and they still have a client base, whereas the middle-class jewelers all go out of business because the middle class stops buying jewelry. They start buying costume jewelry during the Depression because the real stuff is unaffordable. And next. And then finally, just reminding you that in fact Newark made very high-end stuff. And this is Carter Guff from the 1920s. This is a gold lady's purse set with diamonds and sapphires. And inside is a makeup case. It's powder and rouge and an ivory tablet with a little pen to make notes on. And the name and address and phone number of the woman who owned it is all engraved in, because of course anybody like this who leaves it anywhere, it's going to come back to them because they don't go places where it'll get stolen. But this, in fact, this lady's was the widow of one of the winemakers in Philadelphia, so pretty high end. And this is the mark for Carter Guff. It looks like a goldfish sometimes, but it's an arrowhead with a C. And this is Sloan & Company, and you saw that before, but this is a gold shopping purse from the turn of the century in the Egyptian style by Sloan & Company. It would have retailed probably for $500 or $600 when it was new at the turn of the century. So this is clearly not aimed at a middle class market. This is for the carriage trade, for ladies on the main streets of any big city who had a lot of money. And this is, they would have worn this clip to their belt because like the Queen and the Queen Mother, when you're wandering down the street, you always have to have a place to keep your I don't know what you keep in your lace handkerchief, because I doubt they were really keeping money in these things. We think of these as evening bags. Gold purses were a huge product in the Newark industry, all of them made for the very high-end retailers. The Krementzes still own Mrs. George Krementz's gold and sapphire purse from her house on Broad Street in Newark, because I've seen it, and for some reason the woman who owns it still takes it to Maine with her in the summer. I don't think she's ever used it, but she travels with it. So I guess we're never getting it. That's mesh. Gold chainmail was a major product of the Newark factories too. That's a whole other technical thing because it's obviously not made by hand. And then finally, just to end on a depressing note, last slide, just fragments. This is stuff from the Enos Richardson factory that came in with Herman Groth's sort of find. Random bits of unfinished gold and silver jewelry, hundreds of drawings that we got that were presentation drawings of modern tailored jewelry from the 40s, and then photographs of wonderful sort of diamond encrusted jade jewelry, sort of in the Chinese style that Richardson specialized in. This stuff comes up at market quite a bit. I always can recognize it. And their mark was simply an R next to the 14 karat. Nobody knew what that meant. Only geeks like me understand what these marks are. But this sort of gives you a sense of the fragments, and that's what's left now is the fragments. The industry, Krementz in fact was the last Newark factory operating, and they sold out. Literally, it was on the front page of the Star Ledger the day the jewelry show opened. Newark opens this great jewelry store. Krementz sells out to Colibri in Providence. Richard Krementz and his son still have Krementz Jewels, which is in the old Krementz factory on McCarter Highway, which is now where the Easy-Pass transponders are manufactured, but they rent out a part of the old factory so that he and his son can produce jewelry with colored stones, which is what Richard always loved in the first place. And with that, I will end and take questions, and thank you all for coming.
Questions for this?
They make silverware, table silver.
Well, there were manufacturers of silver in Newark. Tiffany made all of its silver here from 1894 to 1985, because I saw the factory in operation still. So, and Unger Brothers produced flatware, and there were probably a few other. But the silver manufacturers are somewhat separate from the jewelry industry, although they're all precious metals.
Is there a database of individual jewelers in these companies? Have you ever?
What do you mean?
Well,
Are there?
individual workers, the jewelers.
I mean, there are in the cases where, I suppose if you went to the archives here for the Henry Blank and Company,
You get there.
Henry Blank was notorious because he went down, he survived the Titanic.
Okay.
So he's like a cult figure in the Titanic world. But in fact, really no, because there are virtually no archives in any of these companies left. When the family lost interest in a company, they didn't sell to somebody else, they shut it down, and they generally burned all their records. and they're you know, the dyes and the Kremen. I don't know what happened to the Kremenson Company archives. They always claimed they wouldn't let me look, and they didn't always claim that there wasn't much. So they probably burned all the old stuff once they shifted into the new factory, because moving into a new building, you know, you don't want to keep all that old rubbish. And more American industrial archives have been lost that way. But really, I mean, you'd have to go through, we have a few oddball little assortments, but they don't really name the specific people because they don't matter. You got to understand this. The genius behind the designs is unimportant. It's the trade name on the object, and ultimately it's the retail name on the box. And that's what's made the jewelry industry so complicated, because, you know, Richard Kremens, who's still alive, started out as a bench worker. I mean, his father made him learn every aspect of being a jewelry maker, so he knows how it's made. He just happened to have a connection so that he rose very fast to be the head of the company. But a lot of bench workers never went anywhere. They stayed at the bench for all of their lives. But some of them went off and started their own. Ferdinand Herpers was a bench worker. He becomes a factory owner, and his sons become wealthy men who live in Short Hills. But most of them actually just stayed working class stiffs who worked at the bench.
That's good.
Yeah.
How much of this stuff is still around? I mean, it was interesting to hear about mass-produced bracelets and things, and is it extremely expensive when it comes up for sale? Where do you find these
It's not
things
as
today?
expensive now as it one was I was buying it. Let's put it that way. Well, there's a lot of it out there. I mean, I can't go anywhere. I can't go to a show that sells antique jewelry of any range where I don't run into Newark stuff. Marked. I mean, I don't attribute it to Newark if I can't tell. Some things are so obvious. And it's a little hard to tell quantity because this is the kind of stuff that people leave to each other and still wear. It's not like tiaras that get put on the market because they're so valuable. And jewelry tends to be very personal in its association. So, there's huge quantity. One of the things I didn't really show is there are various people, including Kremens, who did little enameled things. Kremens did a lot of enameled shamrocks. I bought one for $100 at jewelry camp a couple summers ago. I should have worn it tonight. But there were bazillions of those produced. I mean, and I don't know what that means actually, because I use a word like that. Does that mean there were thousands of them used? I don't really know. But there's a lot of it out there, and this is not the stuff that's going to surface in auctions or break records, because most of it, very little of it ever sells for more than 3 figures. I mean, track it on eBay. Type in Newark on eBay jewelry. You'll also get all of Sarah Coventry, which is Newark, New York, and that's costume jewelry, but ignore that. But you'll still get a lot of Newark stuff cropping up. Most people don't care. The big auction houses do not track Newark marks. Skinner's in Boston does. Some of the more weird auction houses, Rago's out in Lambertville, always makes note of when it's a Newark manufacturer, if they know. Most people don't care, still.
Did Tiffany do any glass work here?
Tiffany Glass is a completely different company. That's Charles Tiffany's son, Louis, who inherits the business in 1902. All the glass, there are rumors of a Tiffany glass factory in New Jersey City or something, but I don't believe it. But it was all in Corona in Queens, was all of the Tiffany Glass Works. But that's a completely different company, never linked. Tiffany and Company sold Louis Tiffany's glass because he was the boss's son. But the actual manufacturing is totally isolated. And by the way, the Tiffany house in the north end of Newark has nothing to do with Tiffany at all. I did a little research and it has nothing to do with Tiffany at all that I can tell. Not to ruin, I just wrote to the man who lives there hoping I can get him to join the museum. I just killed that.
The basic material for all this, would you specify again? Do they come in from South Africa by?
Well, diamonds are South African. Gold is big. This is something you mentioned to me and I forgot to bring it up. The gold rush in 1849, a lot of Newark jewelers actually went west to see if they could find their own gold mines, and then they all came back unsuccessfully. There was the Yukon Gold Strike in 1897, starts it all over again up in Alaska. But so by the time of the Civil War, most of the gold is in fact coming in from the American West, which is one of the reasons it becomes affordable, because you're not paying import on, before that gold was South American, and then South Africa, I don't know when the South African gold mines start, but it's the diamonds are coming out of South Africa, gemstones are coming out of Asia and South America. The only thing we actually produce in real quantity in this country are sapphires out of Montana. and they're a very distinct color. That's a whole subset of collectors love Montana sapphires, and they were used in Newark a good deal.
And of course conveyed by ship and by train
Right.
to Newark, the ironbound thing.
I mean, say that again. I lost your thought because they're being.
My interest was the railroads and the
Well,
ironbound.
and, I mean, Lord knows the opening up of the railroads. Although that's a bit of a hit and miss thing, because I'm just reading a book now by Richard White called Railroaded, which is basically proving that most of the transcontinental railroads were unnecessary and a waste of time when they were built in the Civil War era. But eventually that transportation network becomes really crucial. But a lot of it is shipping, because the California, it's still, believe it or not, it's still faster to get the gold from California through backpacking it across Panama and then up the East Coast. So the railroads, because of course if it's on a train, people know where it is and they can steal it. Because you've all seen the Westerns, that was, gold shipments were a big deal. So. Yeah.
Hi, I have an observation and a question. Just piggybacking on the question about South Africa, I noticed that sort of the way, the general narrative for understanding Newark history and immigration is like the Puritans in the early period, then the Europeans come in the 1800s from all over because of everything that's happening in Europe. African American, the major migration is World War I, World War II, and then it's mainly African American during the deindustrialization period. Latinos come others, but in any case, I think it's really interesting when you look at the question of the diamonds coming from South Africa, which then feed, right, the industrial base here, and then also coming across Combs, I think is his name, one of the earliest leather manufacturers, who sold in 1790 200 pairs of shoes to a Georgia planter. And so
Well, Newark was a major supplier of including Mayor Petty.
no, but listen, my point though is just
Yeah.
simply feeding these economies, like in the South, where African people are conducting the labor under slave or near slave conditions, right? Like South Africa and then in the South. So the point then about African labor being part of economies like the Northern Industrial Boom, though they're not physically there because they're part of the resource extrapolation, I think that adds a really important dimension.
Well, and by the very same token, the virtual slave labor of Chinese people in factories making most of what we own today
Oh, yeah, of course.
is,
it's
but no,
temporary.
that's the sort of unseen history that goes on. Absolutely, it's very much part of it.
Yeah, and then the question that I wanted to ask you in that light is during in the sort of pre-Civil War period and then during the Civil War, it seemed like the situation was very messy in Newark, politically and economically in terms of allegiances to the South, and I was wondering whether or not the jewelry industry sort of lined up one way or the other for specific reasons around the Civil
Well,
War.
most of Newark initially lined up against Abraham Lincoln and then shifted to him when it became politically expedient, as did Philadelphia and most of Pennsylvania, because they were a border state to the south. But other people, again, I'm a decorative arts curator, not a historian, but Newark was very recalcitrant as far as a northern industrial city went, because so much of the goods here were shipped to the south. And again, Thomas Petty made shoes for the slaves in the south in his Newark factory. So that kind of dependence of economy. But it's, but I can't, I don't really know, because no one's ever, there's so little information about the Newark jewelry industry. I'm assuming they followed whatever the general trend was among manufacturers in the city at the time.
I think John Cunningham said that half the jewelry output went to New York and the other half went south.
Well, I mean, before the Civil War, every single bit of the really big money in America was slave-driven in the South. And this is something I've been researching from a different point of view. And then during the Civil War, that whole balance of power shifts. And it all becomes northern industrial money, and that's why the first railroads go west from the north.
You mentioned that the manufacturers later on set up their own retail operations, outlets that served to undermine their industry. Were they setting up those retail outlets in Newark and other cities, or primarily here?
Well, no, that's a good question. I don't think they were selling retail, and that they were selling directly to the stores under their own name, trying to establish their own name brand. So they advertise in magazines, you know, go to your department store and buy a Kremens something or other. So I don't think they were setting up retail stores, but they were undermining the wholesalers. So that begins to sort of cause this festering in the business because they're trying to get on top.
Could you say something about watches, which are also sort of like jewelry?
Yeah, watches are tricky because
Were they
watches were not manufactured in Newark. Watch cases were manufactured by the
Watch
millions. The
bands.
Crescent Watch Company in Newark produced 1 million watch cases a year for Walthams and Hamiltons and all sorts of watches that were being mass produced. It's very hard to track those because they often are not marked because it's all about the watch, not about the case. Which is why when we can find a few of them, but it was a bit, and watch people tell me that it's a huge industry.
And they were said as jewelry also.
Well, they were jewelry.
I mean, enamel, elaborate settings. and
No,
stuff.
those were never made in Newark, and those are almost never made in the U.S. The really elaborate watch cases are usually European.
And what about watch bands? One of those companies was making a lot of watch
I
bands.
mean bracelets. I mean,
Yeah.
like,
The
because
first woman's watch band.
yeah,
was
well, that's
made.
yes. Henry Blanken Company
That's
actually. Henry Blanken Company becomes a major. Thank you for bringing that up. They become a major producer of watches in the 20th century, and in fact, they have a brand name that goes on into the 1960s called Creso, and they do a lot of watches. I should have, because a lot of the archives here show that. But they basically developed the first expandable watch band for a woman. Women wear them long before men do. Men only wear watches on their wrists because of military purposes during World War
Yeah,
I.
that one,
Hmm?
watches, wristwatches were invented by a woman.
Is that true? Although the Empress Eugenie had a bracelet watch in the 1850s, so I mean, basically, probably everything to do with jewelry is invented by women one way or another. But the sort of the mechanical expertise of these are actually German patents that are bought before World War I.
That may be a good note to end on.